What if everything you've believed about being an empath is wrong? What if your greatest strength was never your kindness? What if the reason people keep draining you isn't because you're too compassionate, but because you've confused empathy with self-sacrifice? Think about that for a moment. The world celebrates people who give everything away. It applauds those who carry everyone else's pain, fix everyone else's problems, and stay silent to keep the peace. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A person who absorbs everyone else's emotions isn't emotionally powerful. They're emotionally unprotected. And the day you finally heal, everything changes. Not because you become colder. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop abandoning yourself. That's the transformation almost nobody talks about. A healed empath doesn't lose their heart. They finally gain control of it. And that changes every relationship, every conversation, every decision, and every room they walk into. Because healing doesn't make you less emotional. It makes you impossible to manipulate. You begin to notice what you ignored before. You hear what people don't say. You recognize guilt disguised as love. You see control disguised as concern. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. And for the first time in your life, your peace becomes more valuable than their approval. That isn't selfish. That's freedom. So today, we're going to uncover what a healed empath truly becomes, and why the strongest people in the room are rarely the loudest. Because once you understand this transformation, you'll never see yourself, or the people around you, the same way again. Have you ever noticed that the people who give the most rarely complain the loudest? They don't announce their exhaustion. They don't send dramatic messages explaining how much they've sacrificed. They simply keep showing up, keep listening, keep understanding, and keep making room for everyone else. That's why so many people miss the warning signs. They mistake silence for strength and endless patience for endless availability. But patience has a limit, even when it's wrapped in compassion. The person who always understands eventually begins to ask a quiet question: who understands me? The answer to that question changes everything. Most people don't intentionally take advantage of someone who cares deeply. It happens gradually. A favor becomes an expectation. Emotional support becomes an obligation. Being available at all hours becomes the standard instead of the exception. The relationship slowly shifts from mutual appreciation to quiet dependence. At first, the empath doesn't notice because helping others feels natural. They believe relationships go through seasons. They tell themselves everyone struggles sometimes. They excuse behavior that they would never excuse if it happened to someone they loved. They convince themselves that tomorrow will be different, that appreciation will eventually return, that kindness will inspire kindness. But something unusual happens when generosity is met with entitlement. The emotional balance begins to disappear. Instead of feeling connected, the empath starts feeling responsible for everyone else's emotional state. They become the one who apologizes first, checks in first, forgives first, and fixes every misunderstanding before it has a chance to grow. Over time, they stop asking whether they're happy and start asking whether everyone else is okay. That shift is almost invisible, yet it changes the entire relationship. The problem isn't giving. Giving can be one of the most meaningful expressions of love. The problem begins when one person becomes the permanent source, while everyone else becomes the permanent receiver. Relationships are meant to breathe. They require movement in both directions. Respect flows both ways. Care flows both ways. Accountability flows both ways. When that balance disappears, the relationship may continue, but its foundation quietly begins to crack. People often assume that someone who rarely complains must not be hurting. That's one of the biggest misunderstandings we make. Some people process pain by speaking about it immediately. Others process it by becoming quieter. They observe more. They share less. They stop explaining every feeling because experience has taught them that explanations don't always lead to understanding. They begin paying attention to patterns instead of promises. They stop listening only to words and start watching actions. That is the moment many people completely misread the situation. They think everything is fine because there hasn't been an argument. They believe silence means acceptance. In reality, silence sometimes means evaluation. It means the mind has stopped reacting emotionally and started collecting evidence. Every forgotten promise, every one-sided conversation, every moment of being valued only when useful begins forming a picture that's impossible to ignore. One of the hardest truths to accept is that people reveal what they value through consistency, not intensity. Grand apologies are easy. Emotional speeches are easy. Temporary change is easy. Consistent respect is difficult because it requires daily effort rather than occasional emotion. When someone repeatedly reaches out only when they need comfort, advice, reassurance, or help, they're sending a message whether they realize it or not. The message isn't spoken aloud, but it's heard clearly. I value what you provide more than who you are. That realization doesn't usually create anger first. It creates disappointment. Disappointment is different because it changes expectations. Once expectations change, behavior changes. The empath begins investing less energy. They stop volunteering to solve problems that aren't theirs. They stop rescuing people from consequences they didn't create. They begin asking themselves questions they avoided for years. Why am I carrying responsibilities that belong to someone else? Why do I feel guilty every time I choose myself? Why does caring for others come so easily while receiving the same care feels so unfamiliar? Those questions don't produce instant answers. They produce awareness. Awareness is uncomfortable because it shines light on habits that once felt normal. It becomes obvious that being needed is not the same as being loved. Being depended on is not the same as being respected. Constantly sacrificing yourself may earn appreciation in the moment, but it doesn't guarantee a healthy relationship. Sometimes it teaches people that your boundaries can always be negotiated. The greatest shift happens when the empath stops measuring relationships by how much they give and starts measuring them by how safe they feel. Emotional safety looks different than many people expect. It's knowing you can say no without fear of punishment. It's being able to express disappointment without being called difficult. It's feeling heard instead of managed. It's knowing your value doesn't disappear the moment you stop being useful. As this awareness grows, something else changes. They no longer rush to fill every silence. They no longer feel responsible for fixing every uncomfortable moment. They stop believing that another person's emotional reactions are automatically their responsibility. Instead of immediately asking, "How can I make this better?" they begin asking, "Is this actually mine to fix?" That single question protects enormous amounts of emotional energy. From the outside, people may describe this transformation as distance. They may say the empath has changed, become colder, or become less caring. But what they're really noticing is the presence of healthy limits. The compassion is still there. The kindness is still there. The willingness to help hasn't disappeared. What's gone is the belief that love requires self-erasure. Eventually, there comes a quiet moment that almost nobody sees. It isn't dramatic. There are no raised voices, no emotional speeches, no desperate attempts to make someone understand. It's simply the moment they realize they deserve relationships where appreciation is expressed consistently instead of assumed. And once that realization settles deeply enough, they stop chasing validation from people who only notice their absence after taking their presence for granted. By the time others recognize something has changed, the decision has often been made long before. The emotional withdrawal wasn't impulsive. It was built from countless overlooked moments that seemed insignificant on their own, but became impossible to ignore together. That's why their departure often surprises everyone except the person leaving. They didn't disappear because they stopped caring. They disappeared because they finally understood that caring for others should never require abandoning themselves. Trust is one of the few things that cannot be repaired simply because someone says the right words. It is built through consistency, strengthened through honesty, and protected by respect. That is why people who naturally care deeply often seem incredibly forgiving. They understand that everyone makes mistakes. They know people have bad days, complicated emotions, and imperfect judgment. They don't expect perfection because they know they aren't perfect themselves. But there is a difference between making a mistake and creating a pattern. A mistake asks for forgiveness. A pattern demands awareness. And once that awareness begins to grow, everything changes. One of the biggest misconceptions about deeply compassionate people is that they leave quickly. The truth is often the exact opposite. They stay far longer than most people realize. They search for explanations instead of accusations. They give people the benefit of the doubt when others have already walked away. They convince themselves that stress caused the harsh words, that fear caused the dishonesty, that insecurity caused the disrespect. They become experts at understanding someone else's reasons while quietly ignoring the growing weight of their own disappointment. That willingness to understand can become both their greatest strength and their greatest vulnerability. When someone knows they will probably be forgiven, they sometimes stop valuing forgiveness. When they realize another chance is almost guaranteed, they begin treating that chance as something ordinary instead of something precious. Little promises become easier to break. Small lies become easier to justify. Acts of disrespect become easier to repeat. None of these moments seem large enough to end the relationship on their own, but together they begin creating a reality that cannot be ignored forever. Every broken promise leaves something behind. Even if the words are forgiven, the nervous system remembers the experience. Every time expectations are raised and then abandoned, the mind quietly adjusts. It begins preparing for disappointment instead of reliability. It stops feeling surprised when commitments disappear. It starts protecting itself before another emotional wound has the chance to happen. This isn't bitterness. It's adaptation. The brain is designed to recognize patterns because recognizing patterns keeps us emotionally and psychologically safe. People often think betrayal only happens through dramatic acts. They imagine major lies, shocking secrets, or unforgettable moments of deception. But trust is more often damaged by ordinary moments repeated over time. It's being told someone will be there and finding yourself alone once again. It's sharing something deeply personal only to have it dismissed or used against you later. It's feeling heard during one conversation and forgotten during the next. It's watching someone's words consistently travel in one direction while their actions travel in another. Eventually, something begins to shift inside the person who has spent so much time believing that things will improve. They stop listening only to promises because promises have become familiar. Instead, they begin paying attention to behavior. They notice who shows up without being reminded. They notice who remembers the conversations that mattered. They notice who only reaches out when they need something and who reaches out simply because they care. These observations aren't driven by suspicion. They're driven by experience. This is where many relationships begin to change without either person fully realizing it. The compassionate person starts asking fewer questions. They stop chasing explanations because they already know what repeated behavior usually leads to. They become quieter, not because they have stopped caring, but because they have stopped arguing with reality. There comes a point when evidence becomes louder than hope. That silence is often misunderstood. The other person may believe everything has settled down because the complaints have disappeared. They assume fewer conversations about problems mean fewer problems exist. In reality, the opposite may be true. Sometimes the quietest season of a relationship is the one that comes just before someone emotionally lets go. The conversations become shorter. Expectations become lower. Emotional investment becomes smaller. The person who once fought to save the relationship begins conserving energy instead. There is something incredibly exhausting about constantly rebuilding trust that keeps getting broken. Imagine trying to fill a bucket while someone continues punching holes through the bottom. Eventually, you stop pouring water into it, not because you don't care about the bucket, but because you've recognized that effort without change only produces frustration. Relationships operate the same way. Effort matters, but effort without accountability cannot create security. The deepest wounds rarely come from strangers. They come from the people we allowed close enough to influence how safe we felt. That is why repeated betrayal carries such weight. It doesn't simply challenge your confidence in another person. It challenges your confidence in your own judgment. Questions begin appearing that were never there before. Why did I ignore the warning signs? Why did I believe the apologies again? Why did I keep hoping when the evidence kept pointing somewhere else? Those questions are painful because they force growth. They encourage people to recognize patterns they once overlooked in the name of compassion. Growth often begins with a simple realization. Understanding someone's pain does not require accepting their harmful behavior. You can recognize that someone has been through difficult experiences while still refusing to become the place where those unresolved experiences continue causing damage. Compassion without boundaries eventually becomes permission. Healthy compassion includes accountability because genuine care does not excuse repeated disrespect. As this awareness develops, emotional priorities begin to change. Instead of asking how to save every relationship, the focus shifts toward protecting emotional well-being. That doesn't mean becoming cynical. It doesn't mean assuming everyone has bad intentions. It simply means recognizing that trust should be earned through consistency rather than granted endlessly because of potential. People who repeatedly betray trust often expect another emotional conversation. They expect anger, pleading, or one more opportunity to explain themselves. What they don't expect is calm clarity. They don't expect someone to quietly stop believing what keeps being contradicted by experience. There is remarkable strength in reaching a point where you no longer need endless explanations because repeated behavior has already answered every important question. Perhaps the most powerful transformation happens when someone realizes they no longer need revenge, validation, or even an apology to move forward. Their peace no longer depends on another person's understanding. They stop waiting for someone else to become who they promised they would be. Instead, they accept who that person has consistently shown themselves to be. Acceptance is not surrender. It is freedom from the exhausting cycle of hoping that the next promise will erase the last disappointment. By the time that decision is made internally, the emotional landscape has already changed. Trust hasn't disappeared because of one dramatic event. It has slowly dissolved beneath the weight of repeated inconsistency. And once trust is replaced by certainty that the same patterns will continue, staying no longer feels like loyalty. It feels like abandoning yourself. That is the moment when protecting your peace becomes more important than protecting someone else's comfort, and choosing distance is no longer an act of punishment. It is an act of self-respect. There comes a moment in some relationships that is almost impossible to recognize while it's happening. It doesn't arrive with an argument. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic words or emotional ultimatums. Instead, it begins quietly, deep beneath the surface, where no one else can see it. It's the moment a person stops asking, "How can I make this relationship work?" and starts asking, "Why am I the only one trying?" That single question has the power to reshape an entire life, because once it is answered honestly, everything that follows begins to change. The strongest people aren't the ones who can endure endless pain. They're the ones who recognize when pain has stopped teaching them and started changing who they are. There comes a point where protecting your peace is no longer selfish. It becomes necessary. It becomes the foundation for every healthy relationship you'll build from that moment forward. If you've spent years carrying emotional weight that was never yours, remember this: your compassion is a gift, but it was never meant to become your prison. You can care deeply without losing yourself. You can forgive without reopening the same wound. You can love people without sacrificing your own well-being. And you can walk away without hatred, without revenge, and without needing the last word. Sometimes the most powerful goodbye is the one that is never spoken. It's the quiet decision to stop chasing people who only notice your value when you're gone. It's choosing respect over approval, peace over chaos, and self-worth over endless self-sacrifice. The people who truly belong in your life will never make you feel guilty for protecting your heart. They won't demand that you shrink yourself just to make them comfortable. They'll respect your boundaries because they respect you. So as you move forward, don't ask yourself who deserves another chance. Ask yourself who has consistently earned your trust. Don't ask who needs your energy. Ask who also protects yours. Because the quality of your life will always be shaped by the people who have access to your mind, your heart, and your time. If this message resonated with you, take it as a reminder, not that you need to become colder, but that you need to become wiser. Let your kindness remain, but let your standards rise. Let your heart stay open, but don't leave the door unlocked for those who repeatedly bring chaos into your life. And if today is the day you finally choose yourself, don't mistake that choice for losing people. Sometimes, the people you lose are simply the ones who were benefiting from the version of you that never had boundaries. The version of you that chooses peace is the version that finally becomes free. If you found value in this message, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more insights on psychology, human behavior, and personal growth, and share it with someone who needs to hear these words today. Until next time, protect your peace, trust your instincts, and never forget this: the people who value you will never make you question your worth. The people who deserve your presence will never force you to earn your place in their lives. Choosing peace does not mean becoming emotionally distant from the world. It means becoming emotionally selective. It means recognizing that not every conflict deserves your energy, not every criticism deserves your attention, and not every relationship deserves unlimited access to your emotional life. There is wisdom in understanding that too many people believe that walking away is an emotional decision. They imagine it happens in a burst of frustration or anger. But in reality, the strongest decisions are often made in complete silence. Long before someone physically leaves, they have already been carrying the weight of disappointment for months or even years. They've replayed conversations in their mind, searched for better ways to communicate, given countless second chances, and convinced themselves that patience would eventually produce change. By the time they finally let go, they are not acting impulsively. They are acting after exhausting every reason they could find to stay. This is why their departure often confuses the people around them. Those who benefited from their constant presence suddenly ask, "Why didn't you tell me things were this serious?" The truth is, they probably did. Not once, but many times. The difference is that their words were heard without being understood. There is a significant difference between listening to respond and listening to change. One hears the sound of the message. The other absorbs its meaning. When concerns are repeatedly acknowledged but never acted upon, the speaker eventually stops repeating them. Something remarkable happens when a person finally chooses inner peace over endless emotional struggle. They stop chasing explanations that no longer matter. They stop trying to convince people to value them. They stop measuring their worth by someone else's ability to recognize it. That shift is incredibly powerful because it removes the need for constant external validation. Instead of asking, "Why don't they appreciate me?" they begin asking, "Why have I been waiting for someone else to decide my value?" That question changes everything because it redirects attention away from the behavior of others and back toward personal responsibility. Your attention and your emotional investment are resources. Like any valuable resource, they should be offered carefully, not scattered carelessly. Many people misunderstand boundaries because they confuse them with punishment. Healthy boundaries are not walls built to keep good people out. They are filters that help identify who is willing to respect your limits. A person who values you will adjust when you communicate a healthy boundary. A person who only values access to you will usually become frustrated the moment that access is limited. That reaction often reveals more about the relationship than years of comfortable conversations ever could. When someone begins protecting their peace, their behavior changes in ways that seem small from the outside, but feel enormous on the inside. They stop responding immediately to every demand placed upon them. They no longer feel guilty for needing rest. They become comfortable saying no without writing a paragraph of explanation afterward. They stop apologizing simply for having needs of their own. These changes may appear insignificant, yet they represent a complete transformation in how a person sees themselves. For years, they may have believed that being loved required constant availability. They believed that saying yes made them valuable, that solving everyone's problems made them important, and that carrying emotional burdens proved their loyalty. But eventually they realized something profound. Real love does not require the destruction of your own well-being. Genuine connection is built on mutual respect, not endless sacrifice from one side. There is also an unexpected calm that arrives when someone stops trying to control outcomes they were never responsible for in the first place. They accept that they cannot force honesty into someone who prefers deception. They cannot force gratitude into someone who feels entitled. They cannot force maturity into someone unwilling to grow. The only thing they truly control is the standard they set for who remains close to them. That realization removes an enormous emotional burden. Instead of constantly managing other people's feelings, they begin managing their own energy. They become more intentional about the environments they enter, the conversations they entertain, and the people they trust. This isn't because they have become suspicious of everyone. It's because experience has taught them that peace is easier to protect than it is to rebuild after it has been repeatedly disrupted. One of the strongest signs of emotional growth is the ability to walk away without needing the other person to agree with your decision. That level of confidence doesn't develop overnight. It grows through painful lessons, difficult conversations, and moments of choosing self-respect over temporary comfort. Eventually, approval loses its power because your decisions are no longer based on avoiding disappointment. They are based on preserving your integrity. People often expect closure to come from one final conversation. They imagine there will be perfect words that explain everything and heal every wound. But life rarely works that way. Sometimes closure comes from recognizing that you already have all the information you need. Repeated actions have already answered the questions that endless conversations never could. Waiting for a different explanation only delays accepting the truth that has been visible all along. As peace becomes the priority, something else quietly disappears: resentment. Holding on to resentment requires continuous emotional investment in the very situation you're trying to leave behind. Letting go doesn't always mean forgetting. It means refusing to allow yesterday's disappointments to continue controlling today's decisions. That freedom is one of the greatest gifts a person can give themselves. The most surprising part of this transformation is that kindness does not disappear. Compassion does not disappear. The desire to help others remains. What changes is the direction in which those qualities are applied. They are no longer offered without discernment. They are shared with people who demonstrate appreciation, honesty, and reciprocity. Kindness becomes intentional instead of automatic. Trust becomes earned instead of assumed. From the outside, people may say, "You've changed," and they're right. But change is not always a loss. Sometimes it is evidence that painful experiences were allowed to become teachers instead of permanent wounds. The same heart that once gave endlessly still exists, but it has learned that generosity without wisdom invites exhaustion. The same compassion remains, but it is now guided by self-respect rather than guilt. By the time someone reaches this point, looking back no longer feels necessary. They are no longer searching for signs that they made the right decision, because their daily sense of peace has already become the answer. They wake up with less emotional weight, fewer internal battles, and a clearer understanding of what healthy relationships should feel like. They don't leave because they stopped caring about people. They leave because they finally started caring about themselves with the same sincerity they had always offered everyone else. And once that kind of inner clarity takes root, it becomes very difficult to trade it for the chaos they worked so hard to leave behind. Before you leave, I want you to think about one question. Who in your life is constantly asking you to prove your loyalty, your patience, your kindness, and your forgiveness, while never feeling the need to prove theirs? Because that answer tells you more about your relationships than years of conversations ever could.